I am Clara, 35 years old, and my family has always treated me like an inconvenient employee rather than a daughter. During our annual family reunion at my father Richard's sprawling Hamptons estate, my brother's wife intentionally spilled a full glass of red wine all over my confidential audit files. When I demanded payment for the damages, my father silenced a room of 30 relatives and grounded me like a child, ordering me to my room until I learned respect. I simply said, "All right," packed my bags, and let my lawyer handle the eviction notices the next morning. Before I dive into how I legally dismantled my toxic family overnight, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your family of your true worth. Growing up in our household meant learning early on that love was entirely conditional. My father Richard demanded perfection and loyalty, but he reserved his actual affection for my brother Brandon. The annual family reunion was always a masterclass in performative wealth and forced harmony. The Hamptons estate was massive, with high vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers catching the ocean sunlight, and caterers walking around with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. It was a beautiful place designed to host beautiful lives. I was sitting at the edge of the massive mahogany dining table in the main hall. While my aunts, uncles, and cousins drank champagne and boasted about their vacations, I was working. I am a forensic accountant and private wealth manager. I handle numbers, contracts, and hard truths. I had my leather briefcase open, my backup laptop glowing, and a stack of highly confidential financial audits spread out before me. I preferred the company of spreadsheets to the fake pleasantries of my relatives. Every keystroke was a reminder that I had built my own independent life far away from their toxic expectations. My brother Brandon was the undisputed golden child of the family. He walked through the room like he owned the world, his loud laugh echoing off the walls and drowning out the soft classical music playing in the background. Beside him was his wife Jasmine. Jasmine is a striking African-American woman with a taste for luxury that far exceeded any visible source of income. She was dripping in designer labels, from her diamond tennis bracelet to her custom Italian heels. She loved playing the role of the wealthy tech founder's wife, a title Brandon claimed but had never actually earned. They were the perfect golden couple in the eyes of the family, completely untouchable and entirely insufferable. They spotted me working and decided I was the perfect target for their afternoon entertainment. Jasmine swayed over, holding a brimming glass of expensive red wine. Brandon followed close behind, a smug grin plastered across his face. Jasmine leaned over my workspace, her heavy perfume masking the smell of the ocean breeze coming through the open patio doors. She looked at my spreadsheets and sighed loudly, making sure people around us could hear her manufactured boredom. "You are always so boring, Clara," she drawled. "It is a family reunion, and you are sitting here crunching numbers like a hired accountant. Why do not you go mingle, or are you afraid someone might ask why you are still single at 35? I did not look up from my screen. I kept my voice steady and professional. I told her I was reviewing critical audits and politely asked her to step back so she would not spill her drink on the hardware. That was the wrong thing to say to a woman who thrived on dominance and drama. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She looked at me, then looked down at my open briefcase and the meticulous stacks of paper inside. She deliberately tilted her wrist. A dark red wave of expensive Cabernet poured directly onto my open briefcase. It splashed across my laptop keyboard, shorting out the screen instantly with a quiet popping sound. The wine soaked right through a stack of irreplaceable hard-copy financial documents. The dark red stains spread across the crisp white paper, ruining hours of meticulous billable work and completely destroying the device. Droplets of wine splattered onto my blouse, staining the cuffs, but I remained completely still. I froze, staring at the destroyed equipment. Jasmine gave a theatrical gasp that fooled absolutely no one in the room. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. My hand just slipped. Brandon did not even try to hide his amusement. He threw his head back and laughed loudly, drawing the attention of several nearby relatives who had been quietly observing the interaction. "Come on, Clara," he mocked, stepping closer to survey the damage. Do not look so miserable. You are just a glorified human calculator who needs to loosen up. Buy a new computer. Consider it a tax write-off for your sad, quiet life. The room went entirely still. The low hum of 30 relatives chatting and clinking glasses faded away into total silence. Everyone turned to watch the spectacle. My cousins, my aunts, my uncles, they all stood there waiting to see if the family punching bag would finally break. I could feel their eyes on me, judging and waiting for an emotional reaction. For my entire life, I had been the scapegoat, the one expected to swallow my pride and accept their disrespect to keep the peace. I did not yell. I did not cry. My emotional control was the one thing they could never take from me. I slowly stood up from the mahogany table. I looked at the ruined laptop, the soaked documents, and the puddle of red wine dripping onto the expensive hardwood floor. Then I looked directly into Brandon's eyes, refusing to let him see even a fraction of the hurt radiating through my chest. "That hardware costs $4,000, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely level. "The documents you just allowed your wife to destroy represent 20 billable hours at my firm's premium rate. I expect a wire transfer for $8,000 by the end of the day to cover the damages and the lost time. If you do not send it, I will deduct it directly from your personal accounts." Brandon's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, masking his uncertainty with loud bravado. "You are out of your mind," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at me. "I am not paying you a single dime for being a buzzkill at a family party. Get over yourself, Clara." I kept my gaze locked on him, refusing to back down. I pulled a linen napkin from the table and began wiping the red wine off the exterior of my leather briefcase. "You will pay for it, Brandon," I replied smoothly. "One way or another, you always pay for the messes you make." The tension in the main hall was thick and suffocating. 30 pairs of eyes watched us, but no one intervened to help me. No one ever did. They were all too afraid of upsetting the delicate hierarchy my father had established. In this family, Brandon was the king in waiting, and Jasmine was his untouchable queen. I was just the necessary utility, the one expected to clean up the financial messes, calculate the taxes, and stay quietly in the background without ever asking for respect. But today, the background was pushing back, and they did not know how to handle a version of me that refused to cower. Jasmine crossed her arms, glaring at me defensively. "You are seriously demanding money from your own brother over a little spilled wine," she sneered, stepping closer to my ruined workspace. "You are so petty, Clara. This is exactly why nobody wants to be around you. You care more about your stupid spreadsheets than your own family." I looked at Jasmine, taking in her expensive designer dress and the heavy diamond necklace sparkling at her throat. "I care about accountability," I replied, keeping my tone flat and professional. A concept this family seems to struggle with on a daily basis. The murmurs in the room grew louder. My aunts whispered to each other behind their hands, casting judgmental glances in my direction. My cousins exchanged wide-eyed looks, anticipating the fallout. The scene was set perfectly for the patriarch's arrival. I could hear heavy footsteps approaching from the hallway. Right on cue, the tall oak doors of the study swung open, and my father stepped into the main hall, demanding to know what was causing the disturbance. The real conflict was only just beginning. My father, Richard, commanded the room the moment he crossed the threshold. He was a man who built his entire identity on intimidation, wealth, and absolute control. He wore his tailored golf shirt and expensive slacks like a uniform of authority, expecting everyone to defer to him instantly. He stopped at the edge of the dining area and took in the scene. He saw the puddle of wine soaking into his pristine floor. He saw Jasmine looking remarkably unapologetic standing next to my brother. He saw Brandon grinning like a child who had just gotten away with stealing candy. And then he looked at me. I stood my ground and looked right back at him, waiting for him to assess the situation fairly. I explained the event with complete objective clarity. I detailed exactly how Jasmine had intentionally ruined my work equipment and destroyed confidential client files. I told him I was demanding compensation for the hardware and the billable hours. I expected him to at least acknowledge the property damage. I should have known better. For my entire life, my father had operated under a very specific set of rules. In his eyes, Brandon could do no wrong because Brandon carried his name and his supposed legacy. I could do no right because I was merely a daughter expected to be quiet, supportive, and invisible. It did not matter that Jasmine was entirely at fault. It did not matter that I was the victim of a petty, unprovoked attack. My father did not ask Jasmine why she spilled the drink. He did not ask Brandon why he was laughing at destroyed property. Instead, his face darkened with a familiar blinding rage, and he directed all of his fury squarely at me. He marched toward the table, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent hall. He told me I was causing a scene over absolutely nothing. He said I was being petty and vindictive toward my brother and his wife. He claimed I was ruining the family reunion with my constant need to be difficult, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. I tried to speak. I tried to remind him that I was simply holding them accountable for thousands of dollars in damages. I tried to explain that these were highly sensitive financial documents that could not just be brushed off. But he cut me off completely. He raised his heavy hand and slammed it down flat against the solid mahogany dining table. The loud crack of his palm hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot through the massive room. Several of my aunts gasped and stepped back, clutching their champagne flutes. My uncles stopped their conversations and turned to watch the spectacle. He pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my face. His voice boomed across the hall, carrying the full weight of his patriarchal arrogance. He looked at me, a 35-year-old independent professional woman, and he barked the most absurd command I had ever heard in my entire life. You are grounded until you apologize to your brother. Go to your childhood room and do not come out until you learn some respect. The words hung in the heavy summer air. For a split second, I thought I had misheard him. The concept was so utterly ridiculous that my brain struggled to process it. I was 35 years old. I owned my own home in the city. I managed millions of dollars in assets for high net worth clients. I ran complex forensic audits that terrified corporate executives. I had not lived under his roof or submitted to his rules for nearly 2 decades. Yet here he was, treating me like a disobedient teenager, punishing me for demanding basic respect. He wanted to strip me of my adulthood, my career, and my dignity, and force me into submission right in front of everyone we knew. The silence broke a moment later. It started with a low chuckle from one of my cousins in the corner. Then another uncle joined in, shaking his head and taking a sip of his drink. Within seconds, the entire extended family erupted into laughter. They laughed at the sheer humiliation of the moment. They laughed because the powerful patriarch had put the difficult numbers-obsessed daughter back in her place. They laughed because it was much easier to mock me than to ever stand up to my father. They were a chorus of enablers, completely complicit in his toxic behavior. Brandon was laughing the loudest of them all. His face was red with amusement. He wrapped his arm around Jasmine, pulling her close as they celebrated their victory. They had successfully destroyed my property and gotten me punished for it. It was the ultimate display of their untouchable status in this toxic hierarchy. They thought they were invincible, sheltered by my father's unwavering favoritism. Jasmine took a step toward me. The family was still roaring with laughter, allowing her to slip into my personal space unnoticed by the others. She leaned in close so only I could hear her over the noise of their amusement. I could smell the sweet, heavy scent of her designer perfume mixed with the expensive alcohol on her breath. "You really are pathetic, Clara," she whispered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "This is why you are just a bitter, unmarried spinster. Nobody wants a woman who acts like a human calculator. You have no husband, no kids, and no life. Now go up to your little room like a good girl." She pulled back and flashed me a bright, artificial smile, playing the part of the gracious victor for anyone who might be watching. Any normal person might have broken down in that moment. They might have screamed or cried or defended themselves against the overwhelming cruelty of their own blood relatives. They might have begged their father for fairness or yelled at the relatives who were pointing and laughing at their expense. They might have thrown a drink right back at Jasmine to even the score. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show a fraction of the rage burning inside my chest. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire body. This was the defining moment. This was the absolute confirmation that there was nothing left to salvage here. They had made their bed, and now I was going to let them lie in it. I had spent years quietly fixing their financial messes, protecting the family name behind the scenes, and tolerating their abuse, because I thought blood meant something. I realized in that exact moment that blood only meant they felt entitled to bleed me dry. I looked directly at my father, taking in his red face, and his chest puffed out with unearned authority. I looked at Brandon, who was wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. I looked at Jasmine and her triumphant, self-satisfied smirk. I memorized every single detail of their faces in that exact second, knowing it would be the last time they would ever look at me with such arrogance. "All right," I said. My voice was perfectly calm. It was not a surrender. It was an acceptance of the war they had just declared. I picked up my ruined leather briefcase, holding the sticky wine-soaked material away from my crisp white blouse. I did not ask for a towel. I did not look at any of the relatives who were still chuckling at my expense. I simply turned my back on all of them. I walked with my spine perfectly straight and my head held high. I crossed the main hall, listening to my heels click against the hardwood floor with precise, measured steps. I reached the base of the grand sweeping staircase and began to climb step by deliberate step. I did not rush, and I did not look back. Behind me, the sounds of their triumphant laughter continued to echo through the massive house, bouncing off the high ceilings. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken my spirit and forced me into submission. They truly believed they held all the power in this dynamic. They had absolutely no idea that sending me up to that room was the biggest mistake they would ever make. I closed the heavy oak door of my childhood bedroom and turned the brass lock until it clicked. The sound was deeply satisfying. The room was exactly as I had left it at 18, a suffocating shrine to a girl who no longer existed. The walls were painted a sickening shade of pastel yellow, a color my mother Catherine had insisted upon because it was soft and compliant. Ruffled curtains hung over the bay windows, and my old twin bed was covered in a floral quilt. It was a room designed for a child who was meant to stay quiet and unseen. I walked over to the antique vanity mirror and looked at my reflection. There were no tears in my eyes. My breathing was perfectly steady. I unbuttoned my wine-stained silk blouse, peeling the ruined fabric away from my skin, and tossed it carelessly into the pristine wicker wastebasket. From my overnight bag, I pulled out a fresh black turtleneck and slipped it on. The soft cashmere felt like armor. Then I reached deep into the hidden compartment of my bag and pulled out my encrypted matte black backup laptop. I set it down on the delicate white vanity table, pushing aside a collection of porcelain dolls my mother still displayed there. The acoustics in this massive Hamptons estate had always been a structural flaw. The floorboards in this particular bedroom acted like an amplifier for the main dining hall directly below. I could hear the clinking of expensive crystal, the scrape of silverware against china, and the booming echoes of my family celebrating my supposed banishment. Above all the noise, one voice cut through with crystal clarity. It was my mother, Catherine, holding court. She was performing for her sisters, my aunts who had flown in from Connecticut. Her voice dripped with that manufactured upper-class drawl she had perfected over the last 3 decades. "You really must see the new spread in the Business Journal," Catherine boasted, her voice echoing right through the floorboards beneath my feet. Brandon's tech startup just secured a $3 million valuation. He is revolutionizing the logistics industry. The investors are practically throwing money at him. And Jasmine, bless her heart, just returned from a shopping trip in Milan. They are looking at buying a summer house in Aspen. They are just thriving. I heard the aunts murmur in impressed agreement. I opened my laptop and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A green light flashed, approving my fingerprint. Next, a retinal scan confirmed my identity. "And what about Clara?" one of the aunts asked, her tone laced with thinly veiled pity. "She seemed quite upset earlier. Is she still just doing taxes for small businesses?" Catherine let out a long, dramatic sigh that I could picture perfectly. She probably had her hand pressed to her chest, acting the part of the long-suffering mother. Oh, poor Clara. Catherine lamented loudly, ensuring the entire table could hear her manufactured grief. She has such a sad, quiet life. She just sits in that tiny Manhattan apartment crunching numbers alone all day. No husband, no children, no ambition to speak of. We worry about her constantly. Richard tries to include her in the family business, but she simply lacks the drive Brandon has. She is content being a glorified bookkeeper. It is tragic, really, but some people are just born to be in the background. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single pang of hurt. Instead, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I opened my primary software interface. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a harsh blue light over the porcelain dolls. I was not a glorified bookkeeper. I was not a low-level accountant doing taxes for local bakeries. I was a senior partner and lead forensic architect at one of the most ruthless private wealth management firms on the East Coast. My daily routine consisted of dismantling fraudulent corporations, tracing offshore accounts, and liquidating the assets of billionaires who thought they were untouchable. I was the financial grim reaper for the elite, and my family had absolutely no idea. I typed a command into my encrypted terminal, accessing the master file I had maintained for 5 years. The folder was simply titled, The Estate. As Catherine continued to brag about Brandon's $3 million valuation downstairs, my screen displayed the actual unvarnished truth. I pulled up the real-time ledger for Brandon's so-called tech startup. The company had exactly 0 proprietary software. It had generated 0 revenue in 36 months. The $3 million valuation my mother was bragging about was entirely fabricated based on a single round of seed funding from 2 angel investors who were currently preparing a class action lawsuit for wire fraud. Brandon was bleeding money. My screen showed an endless stream of catastrophic expenditures. He was using investor capital to fund Jasmine's shopping sprees in Milan. He was expensing luxury car leases, private dinners, and 5-star hotel suites under the guise of corporate research and development. His business accounts were currently overdrawn by $40,000, and the corporate credit cards were maxed out entirely. The golden child was not a visionary entrepreneur. He was a federal criminal operating a blatant Ponzi scheme, and the walls were rapidly closing in on him. But Brandon was only the tip of the iceberg. I toggled over to the main family trust, the financial bedrock that allowed my father Richard to demand absolute obedience from everyone in his orbit. For decades, he had controlled the family through the promise of this inheritance, holding it over our heads like a loaded weapon. Through the floorboards, my father's booming voice joined the conversation. He was laughing, pouring more wine for his brothers. "Let her pout up there," Richard boasted. "She needs to understand that in this family, you respect the hierarchy. Brandon is taking over the primary trust next month. He has earned it with his business acumen. Clara will get a modest stipend if she learns how to behave, but the estate goes to the boy." I stared at the glowing numbers on my screen. Richard thought he was the king of a vast empire. He believed he held the keys to the kingdom. He did not realize that the castle had already burned to the ground, and I was the one holding the deed to the ashes. 7 years ago, my father made a series of incredibly arrogant real estate investments that went horribly wrong. Instead of admitting defeat, he had quietly borrowed against the family trust to cover the margins. When those bets failed, he borrowed more. He took out a massive second mortgage on the Hamptons estate, relying on a network of high-interest private equity loans to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. He was completely leveraged, drowning in toxic debt that he had hidden from everyone, including my mother. 3 years ago, those private equity firms began preparing to seize the assets. They were ready to foreclose on the Hamptons estate and publicly liquidate Richard's holdings. That would have meant total social and financial ruin. That was when I stepped in. I did not do it out of love. I did it because I saw an opportunity to secure my own future and protect myself from their inevitable collapse. Using my firm's resources and a complex web of shell companies, I systematically bought up every single piece of my father's distressed debt. I purchased the second mortgage on the Hamptons estate. I acquired the promissory notes tied to the family trust. I bought out the high-interest loans he had used to fund Brandon's initial lifestyle choices. I was not just managing their finances from the shadows, I legally owned their financial existence. Every time my mother bought a designer handbag, she was spending my money. Every time my father hosted a lavish dinner party to show off his wealth, he was doing it on property that I technically owned. They were living in a glass house, completely unaware that I was the one holding the hammer. I scrolled through the master ledger, verifying that every legal contingency was perfectly aligned. The terms of the debt acquisition were ironclad. Because I operated through anonymous holding companies, Richard thought his creditors were faceless corporate entities willing to accept minimum interest payments indefinitely. He had no idea he had defaulted on multiple covenants 60 days ago. The grace period had officially expired. Downstairs, the party was growing louder. Someone put on upbeat jazz music, and I could hear Jasmine's high-pitched laughter ringing out over the melody. They were celebrating my banishment, completely intoxicated by their own perceived power. They thought they had finally put the boring number-crunching sister in her place. I rested my hands on the keyboard, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingertips. My father wanted me to stay in this room until I learned respect. He wanted to treat me like a subordinate. I decided it was time to give him exactly what he asked for. I was going to teach this entire family a lesson in respect they would never forget. I opened a secure messaging channel to my legal team, preparing to set the demolition in motion. The time for quietly fixing their mistakes was officially over. The harsh glare of my laptop screen illuminated the dark walls of my childhood bedroom when my cell phone vibrated violently against the porcelain top of the vanity table. The sudden buzzing shattered the quiet concentration I had built over the last 10 minutes. I glanced down at the screen. The caller ID flashed with Brandon's name, followed by a rapid succession of 3 text messages. I did not reach for the device immediately. I simply watched it light up, waiting for him to finish his digital tantrum. I finally picked up the phone and opened the messages. Brandon was sloppy careless and completely intoxicated by the power trip he had just enjoyed in the dining hall downstairs. His texts were riddled with typos, but his aggressive demands were perfectly clear. "Are you done sulking up there?" he wrote in the first message. "I need you to do your job for once. Log into the family emergency fund and wire $50,000 to my private brokerage account right now. I had a crypto margin call hit while we were eating, and the exchange is threatening to liquidate my positions." The second message arrived a second later. "Jasmine wants to buy a vintage watch tomorrow and my cards are acting weird. Fix it, Clara." The third message was the one that truly sealed his fate. "Do it in the next 5 minutes, or I am going down to the study to have Dad call Harrison. We will cut you out of the family trust completely. You are already grounded. Do not make this worse for yourself. Learn your place and send the wire." I sat perfectly still, reading the words over and over. Learn your place, cut you out of the trust. He was threatening me with a financial weapon that had 0 bullets. The sheer audacity of his entitlement was breathtaking. Brandon genuinely believed that the family emergency fund was a magical, endless pool of cash generated by my father's brilliant investments. He had no idea that the emergency fund was actually a private liquidity pool I had personally established years ago to keep them from defaulting on their taxes. It was my money. He was demanding I use my own money to cover his catastrophic gambling debts, while simultaneously threatening to disinherit me from an estate that I already legally owned. A normal sister might have argued. She might have texted back out of pure rage, defending her dignity or crying about the unfairness of the situation. She might have run downstairs and screamed at him for having the nerve to ask for money 20 minutes after publicly humiliating her. I did not type a single letter in response. I placed the phone face down on the vanity table, effectively silencing his demands. I did not feel a trace of anger anymore. The burning sensation in my chest had evaporated completely, replaced by a freezing, absolute certainty. I turned my attention back to my encrypted terminal. I navigated past the ledgers and the offshore tracing algorithms. I opened a highly secured hidden directory on my firm's server. Inside this folder were the executable commands I had spent the last 3 years meticulously building, structuring, and refining. I had created these protocols as a fail-safe and emergency ripcord in case my father's house of cards ever threatened to pull my own professional reputation down with it. I had named the primary executable file Protocol Black. It was designed to be a total financial reset. It was a scorched earth mechanism that would instantly recall every single leveraged asset default, every breached covenant, and freeze every line of credit tied to my holding companies. I had hesitated to use it for years, because a small, naive part of me still believed that blood demanded loyalty. I had convinced myself that keeping them afloat was my duty as a daughter. But my father had shattered that delusion the moment he slammed his hand on the dining table and treated me like garbage to entertain his golden child. I hovered my cursor over the execution command. I could hear the faint muffled sound of Brandon laughing downstairs, totally oblivious to the digital guillotine hovering directly over his neck. I clicked execute. The software interface immediately flashed a bright red warning prompt asking for final administrative confirmation. I typed in my secondary clearance password and hit enter. The sequence began instantly. I watched my screen split into multiple automated task windows as Protocol Black deployed across the financial network. The first automated process targeted Brandon directly. His entire lifestyle was funded by revolving corporate credit lines that were secretly backed by my private equity firm. The system identified his 3 platinum cards and instantly flagged them for catastrophic default. I did not just lower his limit, I terminated the accounts entirely. Then the protocol accessed the seed funding accounts for his fraudulent tech startup. I initiated a direct freeze on the remaining capital citing suspected wire fraud and unauthorized diversion of investor funds. By the time he woke up tomorrow morning, his bank accounts would be locked tight. He would not be able to buy Jasmine her vintage watch. He would not be able to pay for a cup of coffee. His crypto margin call would go unanswered, and his positions would be forcibly liquidated by the exchange. The second process was much larger and far more devastating. The system targeted my father. Richard's massive second mortgage on the Hamptons estate, the one he took out to pay for Brandon's wedding, and Jasmine's designer lifestyle, had been in breach of contract for 90 days. I had been quietly waiving the penalties to keep a roof over their heads. I overrode that waiver. The software automatically generated a formal notice of default and transmitted it directly to the local county clerk's electronic filing system. Simultaneously, the protocol drafted a 24-hour eviction notice. Because the property was officially owned by my holding corporation and my father was legally classified as a defaulting tenant, I possessed the absolute right to demand immediate vacatur. The document was populated, verified, and transmitted to a local process server with strict instructions for priority morning delivery. The final process targeted the legendary family trust itself. For decades, my mother and father had used the promise of this trust to manipulate extended relatives, command respect, and keep me obedient. The protocol initiated a total asset liquidation to cover the massive promissory notes my father had secretly signed. The system began seizing the stock portfolios, the secondary properties, and the luxury vehicles that had been used as collateral. I sat back in the delicate floral chair and watched the lines of code cascade down my screen. It took less than 45 seconds for the entire financial architecture of my family to be systematically dismantled. $50,000 Brandon had demanded. He wanted $50,000 to save his gambling habit. In his arrogance, he had pushed me to release the exact mechanism that would cost him millions. He wanted to cut me out of the will. I had just deleted the will entirely. My phone buzzed again against the table. I ignored it. I watched the progress bars on my screen hit 100% one by one. The server returned a sequence of green confirmation checkmarks. The debts were called in. The assets were frozen. The eviction was filed. Downstairs, the jazz music swelled and someone clinked a glass offering a toast. They were drinking expensive wine, sitting in a multi-million-dollar estate, wearing designer clothes, believing they were the masters of the universe. They had absolutely no idea that, legally speaking, they were already bankrupt. They were ghosts haunting a house they no longer owned, spending money that no longer existed. I closed my laptop and slid it safely back into my bag. The glowing blue light vanished, plunging my childhood room back into darkness. The air felt incredibly light. For 35 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their expectations, their debts, and their constant disapproval. I had twisted myself into knots, trying to be the perfect invisible daughter, hoping that one day they might look at me with a fraction of the pride they showered on Brandon. I did not want their pride anymore. I wanted my dignity back. I zipped my overnight bag shut. The trap was perfectly set and the execution was completely out of my hands now. The banking algorithms and the legal system would take over from here. I had done my part. Now it was time to leave this house and never look back. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed twice, echoing through the massive estate. At 2 in the morning, the house was finally completely dead silent. The jazz music had been shut off hours ago. The loud, drunken laughter of my relatives had slowly faded into heavy snores, echoing from the various guest bedrooms down the hall. They were all sleeping soundly wrapped in expensive Egyptian cotton sheets, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse I had just unleashed upon them. I stood up from the delicate vanity chair and pulled my sleek leather overnight bag from the closet. I moved with quiet, methodical precision. I packed only the items I had brought with me. I left behind the expensive silk scarves and the pearl necklace my mother had gifted me 5 years ago. I had discovered years later that she purchased those pearls using a department store credit card she fraudulently opened using my social security number. I left the jewelry sitting on the heavy oak dresser. I did not want a single physical tie to this place. I turned my attention to the twin bed. I stripped the messy blankets and remade the bed with military precision, pulling the crisp white sheets tight into perfect hospital corners. I smoothed out every single wrinkle on the floral quilt until the surface was entirely flat. It looked like a museum display. It looked like nobody had ever slept there because nobody truly lived in this room. It was just a holding cell for the family scapegoat. I picked up the ruined matte black laptop. The expensive red wine Jasmine had intentionally spilled earlier had dried into a sticky, dark crust across the keyboard. The screen was completely dead, the internal hardware fried beyond repair. I walked over to the pristine bed and placed the destroyed computer exactly in the center of the floral quilt. It was a monument to their sheer arrogance. Then I reached into the false bottom of my leather overnight bag and extracted a thick, heavy manila folder. I had printed these documents weeks ago, keeping them locked in my office safe, waiting for the exact day I finally decided I had endured enough. The front of the folder was stamped with a stark red warning that read "Confidential" in bold block letters. I placed the thick folder perfectly aligned right next to the ruined laptop. Inside those 200 pages lay the complete forensic financial autopsy of the entire family empire. It was a masterpiece of investigative accounting. Page 1 contained the finalized property deed to the Hamptons estate showing my anonymous holding company as the sole legal owner of the ground they were currently sleeping on. I had included the secret second mortgage documents my father had desperately signed 3 years ago to pay for Brandon's lavish wedding. I remembered sitting in the pews at that wedding, watching Jasmine walk down the aisle in a custom designer gown, while my father gave a toast about hard work and family values. He had essentially sold the roof over his own head to fund that party, and he had done it through predatory lenders. I had purchased that exact debt through a proxy firm. I owned the loan and I had just called it in. Page 10 held the precise tracking data for Brandon's supposedly thriving tech startup. The spreadsheets detailed the exact routing numbers showing how he embezzled millions in investor capital and funneled the cash directly into Jasmine's offshore shopping accounts. It mapped out every fake expense, every ghost employee, and every fraudulent wire transfer. Page 50 contained the raw bank statements from my mother Catherine's personal checking accounts. For years, she had maintained an illusion of old money grace, hosting charity galas, and judging her friends for their financial missteps. The folder contained the proof that her credit was entirely leveraged against phantom assets. Her beloved country club memberships, her weekly spa retreats, and her European shopping trips were all funded by an intricate shell game of transferring balances between high-interest credit cards. The moment my algorithms froze the main accounts, her entire social standing would evaporate. Her cards would decline at the salon. Her checks to the country club would bounce. The high society friends she valued more than her own daughter would immediately smell the blood in the water and turn their backs on her. The final page in the stack was a legally binding 24-hour eviction notice demanding Richard vacate my property immediately. It was a loaded gun sitting quietly on a ruffled bedspread. I knew exactly how the morning would play out. My father would wake up hungover and furious that I had not come downstairs to beg for his forgiveness. He would march up the grand staircase and kick my door open, ready to scream at me and demand I apologize to Brandon. He would find the room entirely empty. He would see the folder sitting on the bed. He would rip it open, expecting to find a groveling apology letter or a tearful goodbye. Instead, he would read the foreclosure notices. He would see the evidence of his golden son committing federal wire fraud. He would realize that the daughter he banished to her room was actually the landlord preparing to throw him out onto the street. I took one last look around the pastel yellow walls. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no nostalgia clinging to me. There was no lingering childhood trauma begging for closure. The fire in my chest had burned out, leaving nothing but cold, hard resolution. I swung my overnight bag over my shoulder and grasped the brass door handle. I turned the lock silently and pulled the door open. The hallway was pitch black. I stepped out and closed the door behind me with a soft, definitive click. I moved down the corridor with practiced ease. I knew exactly which floorboards creaked and where to step to avoid the noisy spots. I had learned to navigate this house in total silence as a teenager to avoid waking my father when he came home angry after losing money at the golf course. Those survival skills were finally paying off for the very last time. I passed the portrait gallery on the second-floor landing. Massive framed photographs lined the walls, showcasing decades of manufactured family perfection. There was Brandon in his high school varsity jacket. There was my father shaking hands with local politicians. There was my mother wearing her stolen pearls. I was entirely absent from the gallery. They had stopped displaying my pictures when I refused to go to law school and chose forensic accounting instead. My practical career choice did not fit their glamorous narrative, so they simply erased me from the visual history of the house. Looking at the blank spaces on the wall where my photos should have been, I felt a profound sense of relief. They had spent my entire life trying to erase me. Tonight, I was finally returning the favor. I descended the grand, sweeping staircase. The dining room below was a total disaster zone. Empty champagne bottles littered the expensive mahogany table. Half-eaten plates of catered food were abandoned on the antique sideboards. They had not even bothered to clean up their own mess. They just left it for the hired staff who would arrive at dawn. It was the perfect visual representation of how they lived their entire lives, making massive, destructive financial messes and expecting other people to quietly clean them up. I did not stop to look at the stained floor where I had been humiliated just hours earlier. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and kept walking straight toward the kitchen, where the back exit led to the private driveway. I was completely ready to leave this nightmare behind. I pushed through the heavy swinging doors into the massive custom chef kitchen. The vast room was bathed in the harsh white glow of the open refrigerator. Standing directly in the spill of that cold light was Jasmine. She was wearing a floor-length silk designer robe that cost more than my first car. Her thick dark hair was wrapped flawlessly in a silk bonnet, and her manicured fingers were wrapped around a crystal glass of imported sparkling water. She turned as the doors swung shut behind me. Her dark eyes immediately dropped to the leather overnight bag slung across my shoulder. A slow, victorious smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. She thought she was looking at a broken woman. She thought she was witnessing the final humiliating retreat of the family outcasts slinking away into the shadows after a public execution. "Running away so soon, Clara?" she asked. Her voice was a theatrical whisper designed to sound sympathetic, but laced with pure, undiluted malice. "I figured you would at least stay until morning to give Brandon that apology your father demanded. Or are you too ashamed to show your face in the daylight? I stopped walking. I did not drop my bag and I did not break eye contact. I simply watched her perform. Jasmine thrived on this kind of manufactured dominance. She loved playing the role of the untouchable matriarch in training. She truly believed that marrying my brother had elevated her to some elite, untouchable status. She had no idea that her entire royal identity was built on a foundation of massive federal wire fraud and toxic private equity debt. I took a sip of my water. Jasmine continued stepping away from the refrigerator and leaning casually against the imported marble kitchen island. You really brought this on yourself tonight. You embarrassed Brandon in front of the entire family over a stupid laptop. You have always been so jealous of him. It is honestly pathetic to watch a 35-year-old woman act like a resentful child. I remained perfectly silent. My lack of reaction seemed to irritate her. She wanted me to argue. She wanted me to cry or scream or defend my dignity so she could relay the story of my pathetic breakdown to my mother Catherine in the morning. When I gave her absolutely nothing to work with, she decided to escalate the attack. She took a step closer, her expensive perfume filling the space between us. You should know your father made his final decision tonight after you stomped upstairs, Jasmine said, her smirk widening into a full, confident grin. Richard is officially signing the primary trust over to Brandon next month. The paperwork is already being drawn up. This entire estate is going to be ours. Brandon is taking over everything, and we are finally going to make some changes around here. She gestured broadly around the pristine kitchen with her crystal glass. I am planning a total remodel. We are going to knock down these walls and update the fixtures. And your old room upstairs, I am having it gutted. I am turning it into a custom walk-in closet for my winter wardrobe. There will be absolutely zero trace of you left in this house by the time the leaves change color. I looked at the marble countertops she was leaning against. I looked at the commercial-grade stainless steel appliances behind her. I mentally calculated the exact monetary value of the room she was standing in, knowing with absolute certainty that she and my brother possessed exactly $0 in legitimate liquid assets. I owned the mortgage on this property. I owned the credit lines that paid for the silk robe she was currently wearing. I was the invisible landlord of her entire existence, and she was standing in my house bragging about measuring the drapes. If you manage to fix your terrible attitude and learn how to respect your brother, Jasmine added, taking a slow sip of her water, I might be generous. You might be lucky enough to get an invitation back here for Thanksgiving dinner. Though we will probably have to seat you at the kids' table so you do not ruin the adult conversations with your depressing energy. I let her words hang in the quiet kitchen. I allowed her to fully absorb the sound of her own arrogant triumph. I wanted her to remember exactly how confident she felt in this specific moment, because the memory of this extreme arrogance was going to haunt her for the rest of her life. I did not raise my voice. I did not frown. Instead, I let a genuine, warm, and utterly relaxed smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile you give to a toddler who is proudly showing off a mud pie. The smile caught her entirely off guard. Her smug expression faltered. Her dark brows knitted together in sudden confusion. She was expecting a wounded animal, but she was looking at a predator who had already locked the cage. Enjoy the house while the electricity is still on, Jasmine, I said. My voice was soft, pleasant, and completely steady. I did not wait for her to process the words. I did not wait for her to ask what I meant. Before her alcohol-fogged brain could even begin to untangle the sheer terrifying gravity of that statement, I turned on my heel. I walked out the side door of the kitchen, stepping directly into the cool, crisp night air of the Hamptons. The heavy security door clicked shut behind me, severing my physical connection to the estate for the very last time. The salty ocean breeze hit my face instantly, clearing my lungs of the stifling, toxic atmosphere I had endured for the past 12 hours. A sleek black SUV was idling quietly in the expansive circular driveway. The headlights cut through the thick coastal fog, illuminating the meticulously manicured landscaping that my father could no longer afford to maintain. My private driver, a highly trained security professional named David, stood waiting by the rear passenger door. He saw me approaching and pulled the heavy armored door open without a single word. I tossed my leather overnight bag onto the floorboard and slid into the luxurious leather seat. The interior of the vehicle was silent, temperature-controlled, and completely secure. David shut the door, sealing me inside my own private fortress. He climbed into the driver's seat, shifted the vehicle into gear, and the heavy SUV began to glide smoothly down the long, winding driveway toward the main security gates. I did not look back at the massive estate. I did not care to see if Jasmine was watching me leave from the kitchen window. They were entirely in my rearview mirror now. As the SUV pulled out onto the quiet highway and accelerated toward my penthouse in Manhattan, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. The screen cast a sharp glow in the dark cabin of the vehicle. I opened a highly encrypted direct messaging application. I navigated to the contact file for Harrison. Harrison was the family senior attorney. He was an intimidating, ruthless shark of a lawyer who had spent the last 30 years keeping my father Richard out of bankruptcy court and burying the family scandals. My father believed Harrison was his most loyal soldier. My father believed Harrison worked for him because they played golf together on Sundays. My father did not understand how corporate billing actually worked. Harrison worked for the money. And for the last 3 years, the massive retainer fees keeping Harrison's law firm afloat had been paid directly by a blind proxy corporation that I completely controlled. Harrison already knew the financial truth. He already knew that Richard was a walking corpse carrying millions in defaulted debt. Harrison was just waiting for the signal to switch sides and execute the final takeover. I stared at the blinking cursor on my phone screen. I thought about my father slamming his hand on the table and treating me like a disobedient child. I thought about Brandon's arrogant laughter. I thought about Jasmine bragging about turning my bedroom into a closet using stolen money. My thumbs moved quickly across the digital keyboard. I typed 2 sentences. The instructions were absolute and left zero room for interpretation. Execute protocol black. See you at the estate at 9 a.m. I hit send. The message encrypted and vanished into the digital void, confirming delivery a second later. I locked my phone screen and placed the device face down on the leather seat beside me. I leaned my head back against the headrest and watched the dark trees blur past the tinted windows. The operation was officially out of my hands. The legal and financial machinery I had spent years building was now rapidly churning toward its inevitable violent conclusion. By the time the sun rose over the Atlantic Ocean, my family would wake up to a reality they could not bribe, bully, or manipulate their way out of. I closed my eyes and let the smooth motion of the vehicle carry me forward. For the first time in 35 years, I was going to sleep peacefully. I woke up at 6 in the morning to the quiet hum of the city far below my Manhattan penthouse. The sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm golden glow across the imported hardwood floors. I had slept for exactly 4 hours, but I felt more rested than I had in a decade. I walked into my pristine kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and moved directly to my home office. I sat down at my primary workstation and woke up the monitors. When my private equity firm acquired the distressed debt on the Hamptons estate, I legally became the owner of the property. Along with the title and the deed, I also gained high-level administrative access to the comprehensive security system my father had installed 2 years ago. He had demanded top-of-the-line surveillance to protect his supposed wealth. He never bothered to change the master passwords when the property management company quietly changed hands. I had unmuted the interior audio and video feeds the moment I stepped out of my vehicle last night. I opened the surveillance dashboard and arranged 6 different camera angles across my screens. I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched the morning unfold in high definition. Downstairs in the main dining hall, the hired catering staff had arrived at 7 to clean up the absolute disaster zone my family had left behind. I watched them quietly sweeping up broken glass and wiping dried champagne off the expensive antique sideboards. The house was suffering from the heavy silence of a collective hangover. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the camera on the second-floor landing picked up movement. The heavy double doors of the master suite swung open. My father, Richard, stepped out into the hallway. He was wearing his plush monogrammed bathrobe, nursing a severe headache and looking entirely too pleased with himself. He rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck, preparing to play the role of the undisputed patriarch. I turned up the volume on my headset. His heavy bare footsteps thumped against the hallway runner as he marched with absolute purpose toward my childhood bedroom. He carried himself with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully crushed a rebellion. He fully expected to find me sitting on the edge of the twin bed, crying contrite and ready to beg for his forgiveness. He expected me to ask for permission to come downstairs and apologize to Brandon. He did not even bother to knock. He reached the end of the hall, raised his foot, and kicked the heavy oak door open. The wood slammed violently against the drywall, echoing through the audio feed like a gunshot. He stood in the doorframe, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms over his bathrobe. "Finally learned your place!" He barked, his voice laced with absolute contempt and dripping with unearned authority. I zoomed the camera feed in on his face. I watched the exact fraction of a second where his smug satisfaction melted right off his features. His heavy brow furrowed, his arms slowly dropped to his sides. The room was entirely empty. The closet door stood wide open, showing bare hangers. The vanity was cleared of all my personal belongings. The bed was made with rigid military precision, the sheets pulled tight and flat. He took a hesitant step into the room, looking around, as if he expected me to jump out from behind the curtains. His eyes scanned the pristine space before finally locking onto the center of the floral quilt. Sitting perfectly aligned on the mattress was my ruined matte black laptop. The dried red wine stained the exterior casing a dark, sticky purple. Right beside the dead machine rested the thick, heavy manila folder. The bright red ink of the word "confidential" stamped across the front cover stood out sharply against the pastel colors of the room. I watched my father stare at the arrangement. His hungover brain was struggling to bridge the gap between his expectations and the reality sitting in front of him. He let out a harsh, annoyed breath, clearly assuming this was some kind of dramatic teenage protest. He thought I had simply packed a bag and gone for a walk to cool off. He had absolutely no concept of the total annihilation waiting inside that folder. He walked over to the bed and snatched the manila folder with a rough, impatient motion. He flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. I leaned closer to my monitors, watching his eyes track across the first page. The first document was the finalized deed transfer. It legally proved that my anonymous holding company owned the estate outright. Beneath that was the paperwork detailing the massive secret second mortgage he had taken out to fund Brandon's luxurious wedding. It was the same debt he had defaulted on 90 days ago. The debt I had purchased, the debt I had just called in. I watched his face turn a dangerous shade of pale gray. His mouth opened slightly. He flipped to the second page. That document was the formal 24-hour eviction notice printed on heavy legal paper and signed by a judge. It demanded that Richard and all other unauthorized occupants vacate my property immediately. He physically stumbled backward. The backs of his knees hit the edge of the mattress, and he sank down onto the bed, collapsing right next to the wine-stained laptop. His hands began to shake violently, causing the thick stack of papers to rattle. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes as if trying to clear a hallucination. He read the eviction notice again. Then he read the deed again. The color rushed back into his face, transforming his pale shock into a dark, violent purple rage. He understood the legal jargon well enough to realize he was looking at his own financial execution. He realized he did not own the walls surrounding him. He realized the daughter he had banished to this room was the landlord who was currently throwing him out onto the street. He gripped the edges of the folder, tightly crumpling the crisp paper. He opened his mouth, taking a deep breath, preparing to shout for my mother, Catherine, to demand an explanation, to tear the house apart looking for me. Before a single sound could escape his throat, a sharp noise cut through the heavy silence of the estate. Downstairs in the grand foyer, the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly. It rang twice. The sound was sharp, demanding, and completely unyielding. It was the sound of reality arriving at the front door. I adjusted the volume dial on my secure surveillance dashboard and leaned closer to the primary monitor. Through the high-definition cameras, I watched my father march down the grand, sweeping staircase of the Hamptons estate. He was moving with a rigid, furious energy. In his right hand, he crushed the thick manila folder I had left on my bed. He had barely processed the first 2 pages of his financial execution before the doorbell interrupted him. His narcissistic brain was currently working in overdrive, attempting to convince him that the eviction notice was just an elaborate, malicious prank. He was a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life, and his mind simply refused to accept that the ground was falling out from beneath his feet. He reached the grand foyer and grabbed the brass handles of the massive front doors, yanking them open. The morning sunlight flooded into the entryway, revealing the figure standing on the pristine front porch. It was Harrison, our family's senior attorney. Normally, Harrison was an intimidating apex predator in a tailored Italian suit. He was the kind of lawyer who commanded rooms, destroyed competitors, and intimidated judges with his mere presence. He had spent 3 decades acting as my father's ruthless legal shield, but the man standing on the porch this morning looked entirely different. He looked like he had not slept in days. His expensive silk tie was slightly askew. His face was a sickly pale gray, and he was sweating profusely despite the cool morning breeze coming off the Atlantic Ocean. He was clutching his heavy leather briefcase to his chest, like it was a physical shield meant to protect him from a bomb blast. My father did not notice Harrison's visible panic. Richard only saw what he wanted to see. He saw his loyal soldier arriving right on time to take orders and clean up a mess. "Good you are here!" my father barked, letting out a harsh bark of laughter. He grabbed Harrison by the shoulder and practically dragged the terrified lawyer into the foyer, slamming the heavy front doors shut behind him. "You have impeccable timing, Harrison. Come straight into the study. We have a massive problem, and I need you to draw up the papers immediately." Harrison did not move toward the study. He stood frozen in the center of the foyer, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his briefcase. Richard, wait," he stammered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. "There is nothing to wait for," my father snapped, waving the crumpled manila folder in the air. "My daughter has officially lost her mind. She left this absolute garbage on her bed. She actually printed up fake foreclosure notices and a forged eviction mandate. She thinks she can play games with my property. I want a restraining order filed by noon. I want her legally barred from stepping foot on this estate ever again. And then I want you to completely restructure the primary trust. I am cutting Clara out for good. Brandon gets everything. The entire estate goes to my son. Do you hear me?" I watched the surveillance feed as Harrison closed his eyes, taking a deep, trembling breath. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He slowly lowered his briefcase to the polished hardwood floor. Sir Harrison whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the absolute truth. "What have you done to her?" My father stopped waving the folder. His thick brow furrowed in confusion. He let out a scoffing sound, stepping closer to the attorney. "What are you talking about? I grounded her for disrespecting her brother. She is throwing a tantrum. Now get in the study and do your job." "I do not work for you," Richard Harrison said. His voice was gaining a tiny fraction of its usual strength out of pure self-preservation. "I have not worked for you in 3 years." The silence that filled the grand foyer was absolute. Through my headset, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My father stood perfectly still, processing the impossible statement. "What the hell kind of joke is this?" my father demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. "I pay your firm a massive retainer every single month. You answer to me." "No, you do not," Harrison replied, pulling a thick stack of legal documents out of his briefcase. "Your credit lines dried up 36 months ago. You defaulted on our legal retainer. The only reason my firm did not drop you as a client and publicly sue you for unpaid fees is because a private proxy corporation stepped in and quietly assumed your debts. That proxy corporation has been paying my retainer for the last 3 years to keep you out of bankruptcy court." Harrison swallowed hard, looking directly into my father's eyes. "Last night at 2 in the morning, the CEO of that proxy corporation initiated Protocol Black. She unmasked the corporate ownership structure. I received the electronic filings at dawn. Harrison held out the stack of papers, offering them to my father. You do not own the trust anymore, Richard. Clara does. And she just called in every single debt. My father did not take the papers. He stared at Harrison as if the lawyer had just sprouted a second head. He looked down at the crumpled folder in his own hand, then back at Harrison. That is impossible, he muttered. The trust is ironclad. The estate is protected. It was protected until you leveraged it, Harrison corrected, stepping forward and dropping the documents onto the entryway table. 3 years ago, you secretly took out a second mortgage on this property to cover the cash you bled into Brandon's wedding and Jasmine's luxury demands. You used predatory private equity lenders because no traditional bank would touch your debt-to-income ratio. You defaulted on those loans 90 days ago. I watched my father physically sway on his feet. The arrogant posture completely vanished, replaced by the posture of an old, desperate man. We had an agreement with the lenders, my father argued weakly. They gave me a grace period. They promised they would not seize the collateral. They sold the debt, Richard Harrison stated brutally. The private equity firm sold your distressed debt to a higher bidder. They sold it to your daughter. Clara is the sole owner of the holding company that currently possesses the title to this estate. She is the bank, and she just terminated your grace period. The eviction notice in your hand is not a fake document. It is a court-ordered mandate executed at the highest judicial level. You have less than 24 hours to vacate her property. You are my lawyer! My father roared, the panic finally breaking through his denial. He grabbed Harrison by the lapels of his suit jacket, shaking the smaller man. You fix this. You find a loophole. You file an injunction. We will sue her for fraud. We will tie her up in litigation for the next 10 years. Harrison shoved my father's hands away, stepping back and smoothing his lapels. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. Sue her with what money, Richard? Do you not understand what I'm telling you? She initiated a total financial lockdown. Harrison pointed a trembling finger at the documents on the table. She recalled the promissory notes tied to the family trust. She froze the secondary liquid assets. She seized the investment portfolios you used as collateral. You have absolutely zero capital to hire a legal team. You cannot afford to fight her because she currently owns every single dollar attached to your name. My father backed up until his shoulders hit the heavy oak of the front doors. He slid down slightly, his breathing growing rapid and shallow. His mind was desperately searching for an exit strategy, looking for a scapegoat, a savior, or a hidden pile of cash that could magically restore his kingdom. My mother, Catherine, he gasped. Catherine has the offshore accounts, the generational wealth from her parents. We will use that. We will transfer the funds and buy the debt back. I smiled, sipping my coffee in my Manhattan office. It was almost sad watching him scramble. He was so completely disconnected from reality that he truly believed his wife was a silent billionaire. Harrison let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out a separate, thinner file and tossed it onto the table next to the eviction notice. Catherine's offshore accounts are a mirage, Richard. She has been funding her country club lifestyle, her spa trips, and her charity donations by bouncing balances between high-interest credit cards for a decade. She is carrying $1 million in unsecured personal debt. She does not have a dime to save you. My father stared at the table. The files rested there like gravestones, marking the end of his entire existence. The golden empire he had used to terrorize me, to control the family, and to fuel Brandon's arrogant lifestyle was nothing but a hollow shell built on toxic loans and my quiet, hidden mercy. And because he could not resist the urge to humiliate me in front of 30 relatives over a spilled glass of wine, I had finally decided to stop being merciful. Harrison picked up his briefcase. I came here as a courtesy, Richard, because we have known each other a long time. But my firm represents Clara now. My instructions were to deliver these documents, ensure you understood the severity of your situation, and verify that you intend to comply with the eviction notice. My father slowly slid down the door until he was sitting on the hardwood floor of the foyer, clutching his head in his hands. The great patriarch was reduced to a shivering, broken mess in his own hallway. Before Harrison could turn around to leave, the heavy footsteps of another person thudded loudly from the second-floor landing. The golden child was awake. Down the grand staircase came my brother Brandon, clutching his mobile phone, his face twisted into a mask of pure, panicked rage. The second phase of the financial demolition had officially arrived. Brandon stormed down the grand staircase, clutching his mobile phone. He was tapping the screen so aggressively I could hear the sharp thuds through my headset. He was entirely focused on his device, completely oblivious to his father sitting broken on the foyer floor and the family attorney standing like an executioner by the front door. "Dad, call the bank immediately," Brandon shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "My platinum card just declined. All of my accounts are frozen. The crypto exchange is threatening to liquidate my entire portfolio, and the concierge service just canceled Jasmine's shopping appointment. Somebody flagged my accounts for fraud. You need to call the wealth manager and fix this right now." My father, Richard, did not answer. He remained slumped against the heavy oak doors, staring blankly at the floor. He could not process his own financial ruin, let alone fix his son's problems. Harrison, the attorney, did not look at my father. He turned his attention squarely to Brandon. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase one last time and pulled out a second manila folder. He tossed it onto the marble console table in the entryway. The loud slap of the heavy file hitting the stone surface finally forced Brandon to look up from his phone. "The bank did not make an error," Brandon Harrison stated coldly. "Your accounts were intentionally frozen by the primary underwriter. Clara initiated the lockdown at 2 in the morning." Brandon scoffed, rolling his eyes. He marched down the remaining steps, his arrogant swagger returning in full force. "Clara does not have the authority to freeze my accounts. She is just throwing a massive tantrum because Dad grounded her. Tell the bank to ignore her and release my funds. I have a $3 million valuation to maintain." Harrison did not flinch. He simply pointed at the folder on the marble table. "Open it," he commanded. Brandon let out a loud, irritated sigh. He snatched the folder off the table and flipped it open, clearly expecting to find a list of petty grievances. I zoomed my camera feed in on his face. I wanted to see the exact moment his reality shattered. The first page of that folder was a customized executive summary I had prepared specifically for him. I am a forensic accountant, and I had spent the last 6 months performing a microscopic audit of his so-called tech startup. I had traced every single dollar that flowed into and out of his corporate accounts. Brandon's eyes scanned the document. The confident sneer on his face slowly dissolved into a mask of pure white panic. "You do not have a $3 million valuation," Brandon Harrison said, his voice slicing through the quiet foyer. "You have 0 proprietary software. You have 0 actual clients. You have generated absolutely 0 legitimate revenue in 36 months. What you do have is a staggering trail of federal wire fraud." Brandon's hands began to shake. He frantically flipped to the next page, then the next. "You took seed money from 2 major angel investors," Harrison continued relentlessly. "You told them you were building a revolutionary logistics platform. But Clara traced the capital. You funneled their investment money through 3 different shell companies and used it to pay for your luxury car leases, your private country club fees, and your wife's international shopping sprees. You used new investor money to pay fabricated dividends to your early backers. You are running a textbook Ponzi scheme." "That is a lie," Brandon stammered, taking a step back. The paperwork trembled in his grip. "This is completely fabricated. Clara manufactured these numbers because she is jealous of my success." "She did not manufacture the wire transfer receipts," Harrison countered. "She did not manufacture the IP addresses you used to route stolen funds into offshore accounts." "The audit is flawless, Brandon. The evidence is absolutely irrefutable. You have been embezzling millions of dollars to fund a lifestyle you never actually earned." Brandon looked at his father, desperately seeking the protection he had enjoyed his entire life. "Dad, tell him this is a mistake. Tell him to stop this." Richard slowly raised his head. He looked at his golden child, the son he had championed and protected at my expense for 3 decades. Richard's eyes were hollow. He had nothing left to give. He could not protect Brandon because he could not even protect himself from the eviction notice, sitting just a few feet away. Clara owns the debt, my father whispered, his voice broken and raspy. She owns the house, Brandon. She owns everything. We are bankrupt. Before Brandon could even begin to process his father's devastating confession, a new voice rang out from the second-floor landing. "What do you mean my cards are declined?" Jasmine demanded. She marched down the sweeping staircase, clutching her phone. She was still wearing her expensive silk designer robe, her face flushed with extreme irritation. She had clearly been trying to complete her morning luxury purchases online and hit a brick wall. "Brandon, fix this immediately," Jasmine snapped, pointing her phone at him as she descended the steps. "The vintage watch dealer just emailed me saying the transaction was rejected for insufficient funds. It is humiliating. I am not going to be treated like some commoner whose credit limit maxed out. Transfer the money right now." Brandon did not move. He stood completely frozen, staring at the damning financial audit in his hands. Jasmine reached the bottom of the stairs. She noticed my father sitting on the floor. She noticed Harrison standing there with a severe, unyielding expression. Finally, she noticed the sheer terror radiating from her husband's pale face. Her irritation shifted into sharp suspicion. "What is going on?" Jasmine asked, slowing her pace. "Why is Richard on the floor? Why are my cards not working?" Harrison turned to face her. "Your cards are not working, Jasmine, because the accounts funding them have been seized under suspicion of federal fraud. The money you have been spending for the last 3 years was stolen from private investors. Your husband is not a successful tech founder. He is a criminal facing federal indictment, and his financial supply has just been permanently severed." Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at Harrison, then turned her piercing gaze to Brandon. She snatched the heavy folder right out of Brandon's shaking hands. She did not ask for permission. She simply ripped the pages away and began to read them herself. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the spreadsheets. Jasmine was highly manipulative and deeply materialistic, but she was not stupid. She understood money perfectly well. She understood bank statements and balance sheets. She saw the highlighted routing numbers proving that her custom Italian shoes and her diamond tennis bracelets were purchased using embezzled venture capital. She saw the massive negative balances. She saw the cold, hard, irrefutable proof that the golden goose she married was actually a massive walking liability. "You lied to me." Jasmine breathed, her voice rising in pitch. "You told me the company was preparing for a public offering. You told me we were buying a house in Aspen." "Jasmine, please," Brandon pleaded, reaching out to touch her arm. "We can fix this. I just need to move some things around. I can get a loan from..." "From who?" Jasmine shrieked, slapping his hand away viciously. Her perfect aristocratic facade completely imploded. She practically shoved the audit back into his chest. "From who, Brandon? Your father is sitting on the floor crying. Your sister just froze every single account attached to your name. You are entirely broke. Worse than broke. You are going to federal prison." "I did it for you," Brandon yelled, his own panic twisting into desperate defensive rage. "You demanded the trips to Milan. You demanded the jewelry and the cars and the lifestyle. How did you think I was paying for it all?" Startups do not generate millions in personal revenue in their first year. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just did not want to look too closely at where the cash was coming from. "Do not you dare try to pin your pathetic failures on me," Jasmine screamed, leaning forward and pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly in his face. "I married a man who promised me an empire. I married a CEO. I did not marry a cheap fraud who steals money to pretend he is rich. You are a complete loser, Brandon. You are nothing." The shouting match echoed violently through the grand foyer, amplifying up the sweeping staircase. The noise was deafening. The golden couple, the untouchable king and queen of the family hierarchy, were tearing each other to pieces right in front of the front door. All of their manufactured superiority vanished entirely, replaced by vicious, feral self-preservation. The screaming acted like an alarm clock for the rest of the massive estate. The heavy oak doors on the second-floor landing slowly began to open. My aunts, uncles, and cousins stepped out of their guest rooms, drawn by the explosive confrontation. They stood along the wooden railing, looking down into the foyer. These were the exact same relatives who had stood in the dining hall just hours earlier laughing at me while my father humiliated me. They had gleefully watched my public execution. Now they were watching the complete destruction of their beloved patriarch and his perfect son. They saw Richard, the man they feared and worshipped, sitting helplessly on the floor next to an eviction notice. They saw Brandon, the golden child, being viciously berated by his wife for running a Ponzi scheme. They saw the absolute collapse of the dynasty they had spent decades bowing down to. The shock and horror on their faces was absolutely magnificent to witness. I sat back in my leather office chair in Manhattan, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my dark coffee. I did not need to be in the room to enjoy the victory. I was watching it play out exactly as I had orchestrated it. The dominoes were falling with flawless precision. But the demolition was not quite finished yet. There was still one desperate phone call they were going to have to make. The secure line on my desk console illuminated with a flashing red light. Right on schedule. I reached forward and pressed the speaker button. Harrison spoke first, his voice tight and overly formal. "Clara, I have your father and brother on the line. I am putting you on speakerphone in the foyer." Before Harrison could even finish his sentence, my father exploded through the audio feed. His voice was a booming, aggressive roar that used to send me running to my room as a child. "Clara," he shouted, the sheer volume causing the speaker on my desk to vibrate. "Undo this right now. I do not know what kind of illegal cyber attack you think you are pulling, but you are going to reverse every single freeze and reinstate my accounts. You are grounded. You do not get to throw a tantrum and play games with my money." I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair. He was still trying to treat me like a disobedient teenager. He was literally standing in the foyer of a house he no longer owned, staring at a perfectly legal eviction notice, and his narcissistic brain was still demanding my submission. "I am not playing games, Richard," I replied. My voice was perfectly flat, carrying zero emotion. I dropped the title of Dad entirely. It was a tactical shift that immediately registered on the other end of the line. And it is not your money. That is the fundamental reality you are struggling to grasp this morning. You have no money, you have debt, and I own the debt. "You own nothing," my father spat back, though his voice wavered slightly. "I built this family. I built this empire. You are just a vindictive little girl who got her feelings hurt over a spilled glass of wine." The wine was just the catalyst, I corrected him smoothly. "The empire you claim to have built has been a rotting corpse for years. You took out a massive secondary mortgage to pay for Brandon's lavish wedding to Jasmine because you could not bear to look poor in front of her high society friends. You used predatory private equity lenders. You defaulted on those loans 3 months ago. I did not hack your accounts, Richard. I legally purchased your distressed debt through a proxy firm. I am the bank. You failed to pay me. Therefore, I am evicting you." The silence on the line was profound. In the background, I could hear the faint sound of Jasmine crying hysterically. "You cannot do this to us!" My father's voice dropped, losing its booming authority. "We are your family. You are my liability," I stated coldly. "For the last 5 years, I have quietly covered your overdrafts. I restructured your toxic taxes so you would not get audited. I kept this entire family afloat from the shadows while you sat at the head of the dining table and treated me like absolute garbage. You called me a human calculator. You let Brandon mock my career. You grounded me at 35 years old to entertain your golden child. You demanded respect. Well, I am forcing you to respect the bottom line." There was a sudden scuffle on the other end of the phone. I heard the sharp click of heels on the hardwood floor. My mother, Catherine, snatched the phone. "Clara, honey, please." Her voice was thick with manufactured tears. She was using her sweet maternal tone, the one she reserved for manipulating charity board members and guilt-tripping her children. "This has gone too far. We are a family. We love you. You are upsetting everyone. Your father is having chest pains, and Brandon is having a panic attack. Please just come home and we can talk about this over dinner." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I remembered the exact sound of her voice echoing through the floorboards of my childhood bedroom just a few hours ago. "Do not play the loving mother card, Catherine. I replied, my tone completely devoid of warmth. It does not suit you. Clara. How can you say that? She gasped, acting perfectly wounded. I have always been your biggest supporter. Really? I asked. Because last night at 2 in the morning, I heard you bragging to my aunts about Brandon's fake $3 million valuation. I heard you explicitly compare his fabricated success to my sad, quiet life crunching numbers alone. My mother let out a small, choked gasp. She realized I had heard every single word. You told them I was a glorified bookkeeper. I continued, relentlessly pressing the advantage. You said I lacked drive. You said I was perfectly content to be in the background and that I was born to be invisible. You sat there drinking expensive wine paid for by my hidden bailouts, and you mocked my entire existence. So do not stand in my foyer and pretend you love me. You love the convenience of my silence. That silence is officially over. Catherine burst into genuine hysterical sobs. I could hear her retreating, dropping the phone back onto the console table. She had no defense. Her absolute hypocrisy had been laid bare in front of her husband, her son, her daughter-in-law, and the extended relatives who were undoubtedly still listening from the second-floor balcony. Then the line was snatched up again. It was Brandon. He was hyperventilating. The arrogant swagger, the loud booming laughs, the smug smirks, they were entirely gone. He sounded like a terrified child. Clara, please, Brandon begged, his voice cracking. Jasmine is packing her bags. She says she is filing for divorce. The credit cards are totally dead. Actions have consequences. Brandon, I said. You demanded $50,000 from me last night to cover your gambling debts. You threatened to cut me out of the trust. I simply executed your request. I removed the trust entirely. I am sorry, Brandon sobbed. I am so sorry about the wine. I am sorry I laughed. I will pay you back for the laptop. I will give you the $8,000. Just please, Clara, you have to delete the audit. If you do not delete the forensic audit, the investors are going to put me in federal prison. I will do anything. I will publicly apologize to you. I will get on my knees. Please do not send that file to anyone. I stared at the pristine Manhattan skyline outside my office window. The sky was a brilliant clear blue. An apology does not clear federal wire fraud. Brandon. I informed him, my voice entirely clinical. You embezzled millions of dollars from private investors to buy sports cars and designer bags. You ran a Ponzi scheme. You stole from people to finance a fake lifestyle. I will pay them back, he pleaded desperately. I just need time. Clara. Please, you are my sister. You cannot send that file. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my mahogany desk. I already did. I whispered softly, ensuring he heard every single syllable. No, Brandon gasped. I finalized the forensic audit at 6 this morning, I explained, outlining his total destruction. I packaged the routing numbers, the offshore account transfers, and the fake corporate expense reports. I transmitted the entire encrypted dossier to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service. I pressed send at exactly 8 o'clock. Brandon let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap. The federal agents are likely already drafting the subpoenas, Brandon. I continued, my voice slicing through his panic. They will freeze whatever hidden accounts you have left by noon. They will seize the cars. They will seize Jasmine's jewelry. They are coming for everything. You ruined my life, Brandon screamed, his fear morphing into blind, irrational rage. You destroyed me. You destroyed yourself, I corrected him. I just provided the receipts. I did not wait for his response. I reached forward and pressed the flashing red button on my desk console. The line went completely dead. The connection was permanently severed. I sat back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The silence in my office was absolute, and it was beautiful. There would be no more screaming. There would be no more demands. There would be no more forced family reunions, where I was expected to swallow their disrespect to keep the peace. I turned back to my dual monitors. The eviction notice for the Hamptons estate was actively processing through the county courts. The federal authorities were currently dissecting Brandon's fraudulent tech startup. My mother's social standing was currently evaporating into thin air as her credit cards declined across the eastern seaboard. I picked up my fresh cup of coffee. The warmth radiated through the ceramic mug, grounding me in the present moment. I had a 9 o'clock meeting with a new client, a billionaire who needed his corporate assets restructured. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began typing. My sad, quiet life crunching numbers was actually quite phenomenal. I kept my eyes locked on the secondary monitor, where the live surveillance feed from the Hamptons estate was still broadcasting in high definition. Hanging up the phone had not ended the confrontation. It had merely removed the only target they could blame their problems on. Without me on the line to absorb their panic, the family was forced to turn on each other. Down in the grand foyer, the silence that followed the disconnected call lasted for exactly 10 seconds. Harrison, the family attorney, took that brief window of quiet to pick up his leather briefcase. He nodded sharply to my father. Richard pushed open the heavy front doors and walked out of the house. Harrison did not look back. He abandoned the sinking ship, leaving my family entirely alone with the wreckage of their financial empire. Jasmine was standing inches away from my brother Brandon. During the panicked phone call, she had picked up the thick forensic audit folder that Harrison had dropped on the marble console table. She was reading the detailed spreadsheets right over Brandon's shoulder. Her manicured fingers traced the long columns of negative numbers, the flagged offshore accounts, and the highlighted federal wire transfers. I watched the exact moment the devastating reality finally pierced through her denial. Jasmine was a woman who defined her entire existence by her proximity to elite status. She had married Brandon because he promised her a throne in the tech industry. She had flaunted her wealth, treated the estate staff like peasants, and mocked my practical career at every single family gathering. Now she was staring at irrefutable legal proof that her entire identity was a complete fabrication. The custom designer wardrobe, her imported sports cars, and her lavish European vacations were all funded by stolen investor capital and my father's defaulted predatory loans. She was not an untouchable billionaire wife. She was legally bound to a broke felon who was about to be indicted by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The illusion of the perfect golden couple shattered instantly. Jasmine threw the heavy folder directly into Brandon's chest. The pages scattered across the marble floor like dead leaves. She let out a scream that vibrated the camera microphone on my end. It was a visceral, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. "You lied to me!" she screamed, shoving Brandon backward with both hands. "You told me the company was securing another round of funding. You told me we were closing on a ski lodge in Colorado next month. You are nothing but a pathetic, broke fraud." Brandon stumbled, trying to catch his balance. "Jasmine, please," he begged, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. "Keep your voice down. The rest of the family is sleeping. We can hire lawyers and fix this." "Hire lawyers with what money?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the vaulted ceilings. "Your sister just froze every single account. You just confessed to federal crimes on a speakerphone. You are going to federal prison, Brandon, and you are absolutely out of your mind if you think I am going down with you." The sheer volume of her shouting acted like an alarm siren for the massive estate. The relatives who had been hovering nervously behind their closed bedroom doors could no longer pretend they were asleep. The heavy oak doors along the second-floor balcony began to swing open one by one. My Aunt Diane and Uncle Thomas stepped out onto the landing wearing their luxurious silk pajamas. My cousins walked out of the guest suites, clutching their coffee mugs, looking down into the foyer with wide, terrified eyes. 30 extended family members, the same people who had laughed at me when my father grounded me just hours earlier, were now gathering to watch the empire burn to the ground. I watched Uncle Thomas, a man who had proudly laughed at my humiliation just the night before, slowly shake his head in disgust. He looked at my father not with the reverence he usually displayed, but with the cold judgment reserved for a con artist. Aunt Diane, who had always praised my mother's impeccable taste, was now whispering frantically to her husband, no doubt calculating how quickly they could pack their luxury luggage and flee the estate before the eviction authorities arrived to lock the doors. The collective shift in their loyalty was instantaneous. The moment the money evaporated, the family bonds dissolved right along with it. "What is going on down there?" Uncle Thomas called out, gripping the wooden railing. Richard, why is everyone screaming at 8 in the morning? My father tried to salvage his crumbling authority. He pushed himself up from the floor, his face flushed a deep, dangerous red. He pointed a shaking finger up at his brother. Go back to your rooms, Richard bellowed, attempting to use his booming patriarchal voice. This is a private conversation. Everyone go back to bed immediately. For 30 years, that voice had commanded absolute obedience from every single person in our bloodline. But today the magic was entirely gone. Nobody moved. Nobody turned around. The illusion of his power had been permanently broken. Jasmine looked up at the gathered relatives and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. She was not going to protect my father's pride. She was ready to scorch the earth to save herself. Do not listen to him, Jasmine yelled, pointing directly at my father. Richard is bankrupt. He took out secret mortgages to pay for his country club memberships and he defaulted on all of them. He does not even own this house anymore. Clara bought the debt and she just served him with a 24-hour eviction notice. We are all getting thrown out onto the street tomorrow morning. The collective gasp from the second-floor balcony was audible through my headset. The relatives began murmuring frantically to each other. Aunt Diane clutched her chest in shock. The wealthy, untouchable patriarch was being exposed as a total fraud in front of his entire lineage. Shut your mouth, Richard roared, taking a threatening step toward Jasmine. You are a guest in my home. This is not your home, Jasmine snapped right back, entirely unafraid of him. It belongs to the daughter you treated like garbage. And your golden boy son. She gestured violently at Brandon, is a criminal who stole millions of dollars from private investors to pretend he was a tech genius. Your entire legacy is a massive Ponzi scheme, Richard. Brandon lunged forward, grabbing Jasmine by the arm. Stop talking, he pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. You are making it worse. Just shut up and let me think. Jasmine ripped her arm out of his grasp with such force that she nearly knocked him over. She looked at her husband with an expression of absolute disgust. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed the massive diamond engagement ring Brandon had given her. It was a ring purchased with embezzled funds, a ring that would undoubtedly be seized by federal agents within the week. She pulled the ring off her finger and threw it hard. The heavy diamond struck Brandon directly in the face before bouncing off the marble floor and rolling under the entryway console table. I am calling my divorce attorney, Jasmine stated coldly, adjusting her designer silk robe. I am packing my bags and I am leaving this disaster zone before the federal agents show up with warrants. Do not ever contact me again. She turned on her heel and marched up the grand staircase, pushing her way right past the stunned, whispering relatives. She did not look back. She disappeared down the hallway, leaving Brandon standing completely alone in the center of the foyer. The golden child sank slowly to his knees. The arrogant smirk that he had worn for 30 years was permanently erased. He dropped his face into his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. He was waiting for his father to step in and fix it, just like Richard had fixed every failed class and every broken relationship Brandon had ever experienced. But Richard just stood there, paralyzed by his own failure. There was no secret bank account left to raid. There was no more proxy debt to hide behind. They were exposed, raw, and completely defenseless against the crushing weight of reality. My father stood a few feet away, looking up at the balcony. His brothers, his sisters, and his nieces were all staring down at him. They were looking at him the exact same way they used to look at me, with overwhelming pity and complete disappointment. The absolute humiliation in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I reached out and clicked the mouse, closing the surveillance window on my monitor. The screen went dark, cutting off the audio feed of Brandon crying and the relatives arguing. I did not need to watch them pack their bags. I did not need to see them walk out the front door. The execution was flawless and my work was completely done. I picked up my pen, pulled a fresh corporate tax file toward me, and began to work. I had a massive empire of my own to run, and I was not going to waste another minute of my time on people who no longer mattered. The blinking red light on my encrypted office console was the exact signal I had been waiting for. I had barely finished organizing the morning deliverables for my corporate clients when the direct line illuminated. The caller identification displayed the personal mobile number of Harrison, the family attorney. I knew immediately what was happening on the other end of the connection. Harrison had attempted to walk away from the burning wreckage of the Hamptons estate, but my father Richard was a man who absolutely refused to lose a battle without throwing one final desperate punch. I reached forward and pressed the speaker button. The connection clicked open, filling my quiet, immaculate Manhattan office with the chaotic sounds of the coastal wind and the heavy, frantic breathing of my father. He had clearly chased Harrison down the front steps and physically cornered the lawyer in the circular driveway. "Clara," my father bellowed. His voice echoed violently through the audio feed. He had forced Harrison to activate the speakerphone setting and crank the volume to maximum. The booming sound bounced off the stone pillars of the grand entryway, carrying directly back into the foyer, where my aunts, uncles, and cousins were undoubtedly standing in stunned silence, hanging on every single word. "You are going to stop this nonsense right now," my father commanded. He dug deep into his chest, desperately trying to summon the terrifying, authoritative tone he had used to control me since childhood. "You are going to call off this ridiculous eviction. You are going to release Brandon's accounts, and you are going to transfer the deed of this house back into my name before noon. You are my daughter, and you will do exactly as you are told." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and steepled my fingers. He was standing on my driveway demanding that I hand over tens of millions of dollars in seized assets simply because we shared genetic material. The sheer magnitude of his delusion was spectacular to witness. "I am not your daughter, Richard," I replied. My voice was icy, clinical, and perfectly measured. "I am your primary creditor, and as your primary creditor, I am informing you that your demands are entirely irrelevant to this transaction." "Do not take that tone with me," he roared, his panic bleeding through the aggressive facade. "I am your father. I raised you. I provided for you. I gave you the very life you are currently using to attack this family. You gave me absolutely nothing," I countered smoothly. My voice sliced through the speakerphone, cutting through the howling wind and reaching the ears of every single relative standing in that foyer. "You want to talk about providing, Richard? Let us talk about providing. Let us do the actual accounting right here in front of everyone, so the entire family understands exactly who has been keeping the lights on." I pulled up a hidden directory on my secondary monitor. I had memorized the numbers years ago, but reciting them aloud brought me an immense, overwhelming satisfaction. "4 years ago, you received a certified notice from the Internal Revenue Service," I stated loudly. "You had claimed massive fraudulent deductions on your commercial real estate properties to hide the money you were funneling to Brandon. You were facing a catastrophic federal audit that would have resulted in immediate criminal tax evasion charges. You did not even know how to respond to the letter. You sat in your study and panicked like a child." I heard my father suck in a sharp, terrified breath. The relatives in the background began to murmur frantically to one another. "I intercepted that federal audit," I continued relentlessly. "I spent 3 weeks sleeping under my desk in Manhattan, personally restructuring your toxic liabilities. I negotiated the settlement with the agents. I paid the $70,000 penalty out of my own private checking account to keep you out of federal prison. I did that while you were on a luxury cruise in the Mediterranean drinking champagne and complaining to Aunt Diane that I was too boring to invite on family vacations." "That is not true," my father stammered desperately, trying to interrupt the flow of facts. "I am not finished," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. 2 years ago, Brandon decided he wanted to buy a yacht to impress Jasmine's high society friends. He withdrew $200,000 from the family trust right before the property taxes on the Hamptons estate were due. The county was preparing to put this very house up for public auction due to extreme delinquency. I heard Uncle Thomas gasp loudly in the background. The extended family had always believed the estate was paid off in full decades ago. They believed Richard was a financial genius. I covered that shortfall too, I revealed, exposing the depth of his failure. I wired the money directly to the county tax assessor anonymously. I kept the roof over your head. I plugged every single hole in your sinking ship. For 5 years, I quietly fixed your financial disasters. I covered your massive overdrafts. I structured your taxes. I operated as your invisible shield. And how did you repay me?" I let the question hang in the heavy silence. I wanted my father to feel the crushing weight of his own monstrous ingratitude. "You treated me like an unwanted stray dog," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly precise whisper. You sat me at the end of the dining table. You openly mocked my career. You called me a glorified human calculator. You let Brandon and Jasmine humiliate me for sport while they spent the money I was protecting. You took my quiet loyalty, and you mistook it for weakness. Clara, please. Harrison's voice came through the speaker, sounding faint and terrified. Richard is grabbing the phone. Let him grab it, I said. Listen to me very carefully, Richard. Every single time I bailed you out, I kept the receipts. I documented every fraudulent transfer you made. I tracked every dollar you squandered. When you finally ran out of liquid cash and turned to predatory private equity lenders to fund your fake lifestyle, I saw my opportunity to permanently secure my position. You betrayed your own blood, my father yelled, his voice cracking with utter desperation. You set us up. I secured my collateral. I corrected him, my tone absolutely merciless. I used my firm to quietly purchase the promissory notes you carelessly signed. I bought the second mortgage. I bought the leveraging agreements tied to the family trust. I read the fine print, Richard. Did you? I knew he had not. My father never read the fine print. He just signed wherever the bankers told him to sign, assuming his social status would magically protect him from the consequences of his greed. Let me explain the law to you since your attorney is currently standing in your driveway, preparing to resign, I said. You signed agreements containing aggressive cross-collateralization clauses. That means every single asset you own is legally pledged against the debt I currently hold. The vintage cars in your garage, the artwork hanging in the main hall, the offshore accounts you think are safely hidden. They are all officially classified as my personal collateral. You cannot take everything, my father pleaded, his anger completely dissolving into pathetic whining. We will have nothing. We will be out on the street. You defaulted 90 days ago, I reminded him. The legal grace period is entirely exhausted. I own the trust. I own the estate. I own the cars. The eviction notice in your hand is absolute and non-negotiable. If you are not off my property by tomorrow morning, I will have the local sheriff physically remove you for trespassing. I paused, letting the absolute finality of his destruction wash over him. I pictured him standing in the cold wind, holding a phone that was transmitting his ruin to the entire family. You grounded me, Richard, I said, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. You sent me to my room because I demanded basic respect. Well, I am demanding it now. Pack your bags. Your time in my house is officially up. I did not wait to hear his response. I did not care if he cried or screamed or begged for mercy. I reached forward and pressed the flashing button on my console, instantly severing the connection and leaving him stranded in the driveway of the empire he had just lost. I had barely set my coffee mug down on the mahogany coaster when the secure line on my desk console illuminated again. A harsh, flashing red light cut through the calm atmosphere of my office. They were calling back. My father had likely demanded Harrison redial my number, refusing to accept that I had severed the connection. I watched the light blink for a full 30 seconds. I wanted them to sweat in the cold morning air of the Hamptons. I wanted them to realize that my time was a premium asset they could no longer afford to waste. I reached forward and pressed the speaker button. Before I could even say a single word, a high-pitched, frantic voice filled my office. It was not my father. It was my mother, Catherine. She had clearly snatched the phone directly out of Harrison's hands. Clara, please, Catherine begged. Her voice was thick with manufactured tears. She was employing her signature maternal guilt trip, the exact same tone she used to manipulate charity board members and guilt relatives into submission. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We love you. You are acting out of anger and upsetting everyone. Just cancel the eviction and we can sit down and talk about this like adults. I remained perfectly still in my ergonomic chair. The sheer audacity of her performance was staggering. Do not play the loving mother card, Catherine, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. It does not suit you, and it certainly does not work on me anymore. How can you say that? She gasped, playing the part of the wounded matriarch flawlessly. I have always been your biggest supporter. I am your mother. You are a parasite, I corrected her smoothly. You are a woman who built her entire identity on a foundation of predatory loans and stolen investor capital. You spent your life judging the very people you were secretly borrowing money from. And you want to talk about support. Let us talk about your support, Catherine. I leaned closer to the microphone. Last night at 2 in the morning, while you thought I was locked in my childhood room, I was listening to you hold court in the dining hall. The acoustics in that house have always been a structural flaw. I heard every single word you said to my aunts. The line went completely silent. I could hear the coastal wind whipping through the phone speaker, but Catherine had stopped breathing. You bragged about Brandon's fabricated tech company, I continued relentlessly. You boasted about Jasmine shopping in Milan, and then you brought up my name. You told your sisters I was a bitter, unmarried spinster. You said I lived a sad, quiet life crunching numbers alone. You claimed I lacked drive and was perfectly content to be in the background. You sat there drinking expensive wine paid for by my hidden bailouts, and you mocked my entire existence. Catherine let out a small, choked gasp. Clara, I did not mean it like that. It was just the wine talking. You know how the women in this family gossip. I know exactly how you gossip, I stated coldly. You meant every single syllable. You love the convenience of my silence. You loved having a designated scapegoat to make your own miserable, leveraged life feel superior. Well, that silence is officially over. You are going to have to find a new topic of conversation when you move into a one-bedroom apartment. Catherine burst into genuine hysterical sobs. Her absolute hypocrisy had been laid bare in front of her husband, her son, her daughter-in-law, and the extended relatives who were undoubtedly still standing in the foyer, listening to her public destruction. She had no defense left. Then the audio feed shifted abruptly. Someone else had grabbed the device. It was Brandon. He was hyperventilating. The arrogant swagger, the loud booming laughs, the smug smirks, they were entirely eradicated. He sounded like a terrified, cornered animal. Clara, please, Brandon pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. Jasmine is packing her bags. She is screaming about filing for divorce. The platinum cards are totally dead. The crypto exchange liquidated my margin accounts 10 minutes ago. I have absolutely nothing left. Actions have consequences, Brandon, I said. My voice was entirely clinical, devoid of any sibling affection. You demanded $50,000 from me last night to cover your gambling debts. You threatened to have Dad cut me out of the family trust. I simply executed your request. I removed the trust entirely. I am sorry. Brandon sobbed loudly into the receiver. I am so sorry about the wine. I am sorry I laughed at you in front of the family. I will pay you back for the ruined laptop. I will give you the $8,000 today. Just please, Clara, you have to delete the financial audit. If you do not bury that forensic audit, the investors are going to put me in federal prison. I will do anything you want. I will publicly apologize to you right now. I will get on my knees in the driveway. Please do not send that file to anyone. I stared at the pristine Manhattan skyline outside my office window. The sky was a brilliant clear blue, completely untouched by the storm raging in the Hamptons. An apology does not clear federal wire fraud, Brandon Wurst informed him. You embezzled millions of dollars from private investors to buy sports cars and designer bags. You ran a textbook Ponzi scheme. You stole from people to finance a fake lifestyle so you could pretend you were a tech visionary. I will pay them back, he begged desperately. I just need time to move some assets around. Clara, please, you are my sister. You cannot send that file. I rested my elbows on my solid mahogany desk and steepled my fingers. I already did. I whispered softly, ensuring he heard every single syllable with crystal clarity. No. Brandon gasped, a horrible wet sound escaping his throat. I finalized the forensic audit at 6 this morning. I explained, outlining the exact parameters of his total destruction. I packaged the routing numbers, the offshore account transfers, and the fake corporate expense reports. I transmitted the entire encrypted dossier to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service. I pressed send at exactly 8 o'clock. Brandon let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It sounded exactly like a man who had just watched his entire future evaporate into thin air. The federal agents are likely already drafting the subpoenas, Brandon. I continued, my voice slicing right through his panic. They will freeze whatever hidden accounts you have left by noon. They will seize the cars. They will seize Jasmine's jewelry. They are coming for absolutely everything. You ruined my life! Brandon screamed, his fear morphing into blind, irrational rage. You destroyed me. You destroyed yourself, I corrected him smoothly. I just provided the receipts. I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear another second of his pathetic whining. I reached forward and pressed the flashing red button on my desk console. The line went completely dead. The connection was permanently severed. I sat back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The silence in my office was absolute, and it was beautiful. There would be no more screaming. There would be no more demands. There would be no more forced family reunions where I was expected to swallow their disrespect to keep the peace. I turned my attention back to my dual monitors. The eviction notice for the Hamptons estate was actively processing through the county courts. The federal authorities were currently dissecting Brandon's fraudulent tech startup. My mother's social standing was evaporating into thin air as her credit cards declined across the eastern seaboard. I picked up my fresh cup of coffee. The warmth radiated through the ceramic mug, grounding me in the present moment. I had a 9 o'clock meeting with a new client, a billionaire who needed his corporate assets restructured. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began typing. My sad, quiet life crunching numbers was actually quite phenomenal. The next 30 days were a masterclass in the absolute destruction of a dynasty. The 24-hour notice expired at exactly 9 in the morning on Tuesday. I did not attend the eviction in person. I had a junior associate from my legal team coordinate with the local sheriff department. Through the property security cameras, I watched the final moments of my father's reign from the comfort of my Manhattan office. 2 patrol cars pulled into the circular driveway with their lights flashing. Richard attempted to barricade the front doors, but law enforcement does not care about how many golf tournaments you have won or how loudly you can shout. They breached the entrance and gave my parents exactly 30 minutes to gather their personal clothing and basic toiletries. The antique furniture, the imported rugs, the expensive artwork hanging in the gallery, those were all officially classified as my collateral. My mother, Catherine, sobbed hysterically on the pristine front lawn, clutching a single piece of designer luggage to her chest. My father screamed at the deputies, threatening to sue the entire county and demanding to speak to the chief of police. His threats fell on entirely deaf ears. The deputies simply escorted them to the property line, locked the heavy iron gates with a new steel chain, and drove away. They had absolutely nowhere to go. With their bank accounts frozen solid and their credit lines completely eradicated by my software protocols, they could not even check into a decent hotel. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a loud industrial neighborhood far outside the city limits. The apartment was leased under a fake name by one of Richard's former drinking buddies who owed him a minor favor. It was a catastrophic downgrade. There were no caterers, no cleaning staff, and no sweeping ocean views. Their new reality consisted of peeling linoleum floors, dripping faucets, and the constant rumble of freight trucks driving past their single unwashed window. The social death was even faster than the financial one. Catherine attempted to show up at her weekly charity luncheon, hoping to spin a narrative of a temporary cash flow misunderstanding. She thought she could charm her way through the scandal. The hostess stopped her at the front door. Her country club membership had been officially revoked by the board of directors, citing unpaid dues and a morals clause violation. The high society women she had gossiped with for decades, the same women she had bragged to about Brandon's fake success, immediately blocked her phone number. She was entirely excommunicated from the elite circles she valued more than her own daughter. She was left completely isolated with nothing but her staggering credit card debt to keep her company. Brandon did not even have the luxury of a cramped apartment. The federal government moves with terrifying speed when presented with a perfectly packaged forensic audit. Exactly 72 hours after I transmitted the encrypted files to the authorities, the Securities and Exchange Commission coordinated a massive joint raid with the Internal Revenue Service. A dozen agents in dark windbreakers swarmed the expensive leased office space Brandon used as the headquarters for his fake tech startup. They seized every computer, every hard drive, and every filing cabinet. Simultaneously, a second heavily armed team breached the luxury townhouse he rented in the city. The local news channels managed to get helicopters in the air just in time to broadcast Brandon being marched out of his front door in federal handcuffs. He looked absolutely pathetic. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he kept trying to hide his face from the flashing cameras. The grand jury indictment was unsealed that same afternoon. He was officially charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and tax evasion. The prosecutors detailed how he had intentionally embezzled millions in venture capital to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. Because he was deemed a significant flight risk, and because his financial assets were entirely locked down by the government, he was denied bail. The golden child was stripped of his designer clothes, issued a standard orange jumpsuit, and placed in a federal holding facility. He was facing up to 20 years in prison. Jasmine proved to be the most ruthlessly efficient person in the entire family tree. The moment she read my audit over Brandon's shoulder in the foyer and realized the money was truly gone, she did not waste a single second playing the supportive, loyal wife. She had already thrown her massive diamond engagement ring at Brandon's face, and she meant every word of her dramatic departure. While Brandon was sitting in a cold holding cell, desperately waiting for a bail hearing he would never win, Jasmine was extremely busy liquidating her exit strategy. She packed all of her high-end designer bags, her furs, and the expensive jewelry she had hoarded over the last 3 years. She pawned everything that was not explicitly tied to the federal asset freeze. She took whatever untraceable scraps of cash she could find, filed an expedited petition for divorce, and completely vanished. She did not attend his arraignment. She did not answer his frantic phone calls from the detention center. She left him entirely alone to face the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. Jasmine's loyalty was only ever tied to the routing numbers on a bank statement, and the second those numbers dropped to zero, she excised Brandon from her life like a tumor. By the end of the month, the mighty dynasty was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties and analyzed on local news broadcasts. My father was a broken, defeated man living in squalor. My mother was a total social pariah hiding in a dingy apartment. My brother was a federal inmate sleeping on a thin cot. The great patriarch who had slammed his hand on a mahogany table and ordered me to my room was now sitting on a cheap folding chair, waiting for a government subsidy check to clear. The total destruction was a masterpiece of cause and effect. They had built their entire kingdom on top of a dormant volcano, and they had spent 35 years handing me the matches. 6 months have passed since the morning the federal agents raided Brandon's fake headquarters and the county sheriff evicted my parents. I am sitting behind my solid mahogany desk in my corner office, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The crisp autumn sun catches the edge of the glass, providing a perfect, clear view of the city I conquered. My firm has tripled its client base since the spring. The reputation of the woman who legally dismantled her own corrupt family empire attracted the most elite, ruthless billionaires in the country. They wanted my protection. They wanted my absolute precision. The heavy frosted glass door to my office swings open. Harrison steps into the room. He looks entirely different from the terrified, sweating attorney who stood in my father's foyer 6 months ago. His posture is perfectly straight, his bespoke suit is impeccable, and his eyes hold a sharp, confident clarity. When Richard's empire collapsed, I offered Harrison a lifeline. I poached him. I made him the lead and house counsel for my private equity firm. He knew where all the bodies were buried, and he knew exactly how my algorithms operated. He is now making triple his previous salary working for the winning side. Harrison approaches my desk and slides a thick leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood surface. He does not waste time with empty pleasantries. We operate on maximum efficiency. The closing is officially complete. Clara, he states, his voice carrying a deep, satisfying finality. The funds have been successfully wired and verified by the escrow holding company. He opens the portfolio, revealing the final signature pages. I look down at the financial summary. I have just sold the Hamptons estate to an international hotel developer who plans to bulldoze the property and build a luxury coastal resort. The irony is absolutely perfect. The ancestral home my father used to project his fake generational wealth is going to be completely demolished, torn down to the very foundation. The sale price yielded a massive, staggering profit. After deducting the cost of the defaulted loans I initially purchased, the net gain is enough to fund my firm's expansion into global markets for the next decade. I am officially liquidating the very last physical tie to my toxic bloodline. Harrison points to the bottom line, confirming the wire transfer. Before I sign the final execution page, I ask him for the quarterly status report. I do not ask out of lingering affection or guilt. I ask because I am a forensic accountant, and I always close my ledgers. Harrison delivers the updates with clinical precision. Richard and Catherine are still living in that cramped industrial apartment, completely isolated from society. Richard attempted to secure a commercial loan to start a consulting business, but his credit score is functionally non-existent. Catherine was recently seen working the cash register at a local boutique, a desperate attempt to pay off her mounting legal fees. The high society friends she valued more than her own daughter continue to pretend she simply does not exist. Brandon accepted a federal plea deal last week. Harrison continues, turning to the next page of his briefing. He was sentenced to 12 years in a minimum security federal correctional institution without the possibility of early parole. He is entirely bankrupt and deeply in debt to the federal government for restitution. And Jasmine, I ask, picking up my heavy fountain pen. Jasmine finalized her highly expedited divorce proceedings completely in absentia, Harrison confirms. She drained whatever untraceable cash she could extract from the offshore accounts before the federal freeze took effect and vanished entirely. Private investigators believe she relocated to Europe under a new surname, actively searching for her next wealthy target. She abandoned Brandon the exact second his platinum cards declined. I nod slowly, absorbing the absolute finality of their destruction. They earned every single ounce of their misery. They built a kingdom on lies, arrogance, and the constant degradation of the only person keeping them afloat. I lower my pen to the heavy cardstock of the real estate closing documents. I sign my name with a smooth, fluid motion. The signature is bold, sharp, and entirely unapologetic. I slide the portfolio back across the desk to Harrison. He closes it with a satisfying snap, giving me a brief, respectful nod before turning and exiting my office. The heavy glass door shuts, leaving me in total, absolute silence. I stand up from my desk and walk over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I look out at the sprawling, chaotic beauty of the city below. I press my hand against the cool glass. My mind drifts back to that humid summer night 6 months ago. I think about the dark red wine soaking into my white blouse. I think about Brandon's arrogant, booming laughter echoing through the main hall. I think about my father slamming his heavy hand against the dining table, demanding my total submission in front of 30 relatives. "You are grounded until you apologize. Go to your childhood room and do not come out until you learn some respect." That was the command he barked at a 35-year-old independent professional. He thought he was asserting his ultimate dominance. He thought he was putting a bitter, unmarried spinster back into her proper place. He had absolutely no idea that his fragile ego was handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. Being grounded was the greatest gift my father ever gave me. Sending me up to that isolated pastel yellow room provided the precise, undisturbed silence I required to execute Protocol Black. It gave me the physical distance to detach from the emotional manipulation and look at the cold, hard numbers. If he had just reprimanded Jasmine for spilling the wine, if he had just shown one tiny ounce of fairness or basic human respect, I might have kept shielding them. I might have continued quietly paying their taxes and covering their catastrophic defaults out of a misplaced sense of familial duty. His demand for absolute unearned obedience is what finally severed my loyalty. He forced me into a corner, and I simply bought the building. I turn away from the window and walk back to my desk. I pick up the finalized copy of the property deed, the ultimate proof of my total victory, and drop it cleanly into my brass outbox. The paper lands with a soft, definitive thud. A genuine, profound smile spreads across my face, reaching all the way to my eyes. The heavy, suffocating weight I carried for 35 years has been entirely lifted. I pull my keyboard closer, open a fresh financial ledger for my newest billionaire client, and go back to work completely free.